So what's this panel about? Emerging from a confluence of technological tools, theoretical infrastructures, and political concerns of the mid-2000s, the spatial justice framing of the humanities has multiplied the forms used by researchers to share and sometimes make work with the public. Attuned to both operations and contestations of power, these various people's atlases, guidebooks, story maps, walking tours, and geolocated media projects originate in different disciplines and cut across digital and analog platforms. However, they share a commitment to reaching both academic and popular audiences to make spatial injustice perceivable, challengeable, and therefore changeable, we hope at least. The tension arises because while such projects might aspire to expose and contest colonial, racial, and environmental injustice, they also sometimes have to rely on data dependent on the perpetuation of harm and produce work that can be accessible primarily to audiences physically distanced from the brutal effects of these racial and colonial forms of violence. Dominant cultural metaphors for navigating physical and virtual spaces risk reinscribing colonialist paradigms of exploration and discovery. Conventions of the digital interface, like the maps of a God's eye view or GIS applications that center the user's body, are hardly, as we know, conceptually neutral. Yet defying these digital interfaces can diminish the accessibility of the content. What do we do about this? Moreover, such projects usually involve collaboration, not just between similarly positioned scholars, but also with librarians, designers, technologists, students, and non-academic communities that unfold within institutional management cultures that often organize collaborations along hierarchical and neoliberal lines, even while seeking to capitalize, and really we do mean capitalize in the real sense of that word, on the reputational benefits of accessible and inclusive public scholarship. This panel brings together researchers engaged with a diverse array of recent spatial humanities projects to consider the conceptual, practical, and political dimensions of the work, and to really grapple with some of these tensions that I just articulated. What practices of data collection and interpretation might guide the creation of spatial platforms about spatial justice or injustice? What publics are envisioned and assembled by these projects? What roles can design play? What role can design play, infrastructurally, graphically, experientially, to trouble distanced consumption and foster recognition? And finally, what practices of collaboration, coordination, and maybe institutionalization have they developed that further enact and clarify the work's underlying liberatory goals? Now, at this time, I want to direct you to the chat box before we start. I cannot wait for the panel to begin and to hear everybody's work, but I just want to direct you to the chat box where you can drop any questions during the session. We really want lots of questions for our panelists. You'll see some instructions for how to use that toolbar in the chat toolbar itself, so please follow those instructions. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. One more time, please keep your microphone off during the presentations if you can. We've also turned on the live transcription feature, so you'll see that if you hit the closed captioning button and choose live transcript. And again, once again, we are recording this event just in case. Now, I'd like to now turn it to our first speaker, Alex Gill, who is a digital scholarship librarian at Columbia University. He's a materialist spelunker and an author American, which we talked about right before this panel. I learned that I'm also an author American. His larger bio should also be in the chat bar, and you'll also see some links to the project he's going to be speaking about. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Alex.
Thank you. All right, Jenna, and thank you for inviting me to be here. We all have only 10 minutes, so I am going to speak fast and try to get as much as I possibly can so that we can have a very good, rich question and answer. So the first 5 minutes I'm going to dedicate to go over the project that I'm here to represent today, Torn Apart Separados. What is it? What are we doing? It has 2 volumes, so I'll try to go quick. And then in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to try to highlight 3 concepts that we can think through as we explore the project. Now, if the organizers can please share the links to the projects so that people can follow along. But in 2018, when Trump started separating families at the border and the zero tolerance policy dropped, some videos started circulating with kids crying for their parents or their relatives around social media. And there was a global outcry about this. In our lab, we were already familiar with what we call nimble tense, and I'll return to this concept in the end, or in shorthand, with responding to crisis, to moments of crisis, with some kind of deployment of digital humanities or digital scholarship. And we got together at the lab right away when this was happening, and we decided to go to town. I was tasked with forming a team that involved scholars at the border with veteran digital humanists, and we gave ourselves the task of finding where the kids were being housed and unmasking this mysterious executive force known as ICE that until that moment in American history was not very well known by the public. So in the first 7 days, we built the first volume of the project, Torn Apart Separados. In this volume, we focused on the carceral regime of ICE. And the iconic map, the one that actually started circulating in the United States because of a Wired article and several other articles in the press. What we see represented are ICE facilities, or facilities that ICE has access to. The big dots are facilities with present population, and the smaller dots are facilities that ICE has the potential to use. Now, the blue dots are where the kids were being housed. Now, this became the iconic image because it kind of woke America up to the fact that ICE is everywhere. That ICE is not just a phenomenon that's happened at the U.S.-Mexico border, but that this policing of immigrant bodies, of brown bodies, and black bodies happens everywhere in the United States. Now, this wasn't the only visualization, even though it's the iconic one, and I encourage you to explore the different visualizations we made for you. This one, for example. The eye, we are allowed to actually visit each of these facilities in the kind of like satellite bird's view. This was actually very well received by the public, who didn't realize that right next to their beauty salon was an ICE facility. This is volume 1. In volume 2, we set out to map the finances. So if in number 1, we set out to finance the infrastructure, the carceral infrastructure, in volume 2, we set out to map the financial infrastructure and the ties to politics. And also, just as in 1, it has a series of visualization that allows us to see certain facts about who benefits. And for example, the sort of equal opportunity oppression highlights the fact that it's not only white male business men who benefit from this, but actually it's an equal opportunity oppressing game. Sorry, let me skip that one. That was too complicated. In rain, for example, we see the growth from the Obama regime, which is no saint of my devotion. Obama was already doing this at the time. This kind of like infrastructure was starting to get set up during the Obama regime. It just gets exploded during the Trump regime. We can see the sort of connections between the growth and connections between these companies over time. Each of the volumes is accompanied not only by a series of essays and reflections written by scholars of the border. They were written at the speed of lightning as they were reacting to the visualization of the data that we were these scholars that we invited to participate got a sneak preview of the data visualizations we were doing, and we asked them to reflect on them. It's also accompanied by our own reflections of our failures. So this is something like in line with Spivak's own thinking, and like the auto-critique was very important to us. So you will see these reflections in volume 1 and volume 2 that talk about our own shortcomings, and sort of also like the, you know, the things that didn't make it into the main visualizations, but that were worth highlighting. Like, for example, this kind of practice of immigrants of asking for their family members on Google Maps and on Facebook. We found it very interesting. We couldn't cover it in detail. It was covered by the press, etc. So you will find more there. We didn't only focus on what I'm going to call counter surveillance in a second, or you know, how we surveil back to those who surveil us. We also focused. We also built a map that would make it relatively easy for people to find allied organizations depending on locality. They were triple vetted by our team. That means that our team had to find 3 sources that actually vouched for these people as organizations that were worth trusting. So we were also trying to help out a little bit there. Now, I will let you explore the 2 volumes in detail. Let me talk about a couple of concepts here that I think will help us in our conversation. One of them is this concept of counter surveillance. This one's really easy. I mean, I think you already get it just by me when I glossed it. I think you already got it, which is the idea to cite Arjun, what he was talking about, like that these maps already are so problematic. That the idea is also because most of them are designed to surveil us. Most of them are designed to actually serve the apparatus, the military apparatus, the colonial apparatus. The biggest company in the planet that focuses on GIS and mapping, Esri, one of their main contractors is to the government, and they use the technology that you use in storymaps to bomb innocent people in the Middle East. So this is important to acknowledge, but then, of course, like Arjun said, we don't stop there. And counter surveillance is one of the ways in which we can use these tools. So instead of surveilling ourselves, so we could do this like just focus on where are the kids. We actually hid where the kids were. We didn't put the address. So what we do is we actually do provide a lot of information about them and very little information about us, unless we're comfortable with the public. The second concept I want to highlight here is the Re-Ontologization concept. The concept that we don't have to take the world of data that is provided to us as is. And I'll just use one example from volume 2, this example of how we mapped all the companies based on the categories. We use the open data from the government spending, usspending.gov. That's the data that we use to see who was spending what that was going to the ICE account. The problem is that they were using the data, the categories for these companies came from NAFTA, right? And we didn't like, so their categories make them all super innocent. They're all just like, you know, nice little office supply company, you know. So we went through 2,000 and change data points and re-ontologized the whole thing to create so that we use our categories. Are you a surveillance company? Are you a company whose main job in life is to threaten us with violence? Are you there to reform our subjectivities and bodies? And this is what we did. It has a combination of several theoretical frameworks that we did. We discussed it a lot. But anyways, the point is we don't have to take the world of data as it comes. I encourage us to actually re-ontologize the world around us. And finally, is the concept of nimble tense. And I think this is one of the links that is getting shared on your chat. And this is the concept that something that we've done a lot here, not only with ICE, but it's the idea that we use the sort of technological knowledge, the humanistic knowledge that we get trained in humanities department and social sciences, our pedagogical skills. We take all of these skills that we take for granted in the academy, and we use it to respond rapidly to crisis. This project is just one example of the ways in which we can respond rapidly to crisis. The last one I was involved in involved creating 40,000 face shields, 3D printed for New York hospitals and frontline workers at the beginning of the COVID crisis. And the list goes on. We have done this many times. We encourage you to also participate in this mobilized humanities, as we can call it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. And just a reminder to our participants in the crowd, please, questions that emerge for you as you're listening to these amazing discussions and topics, please put them in the chat. That's how we're going to get this to the next level in about 40 minutes. I want to introduce now, very excited to introduce our next two speakers, Sarah Knaus and Shiloh Krubar. Sarah is an interdisciplinary artist, faculty at Northeast University, and critical writer examining the political ecology of landscape and space. And Shiloh, as many of you here at Georgetown might know, is a professor in the Culture and Politics program. Please see more about many of her projects in the chat bar. I will pass it over to them. And again, if you want to know more about the projects, that'll also be in the chat bar.
Thanks, Arjun. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the territory of the Massachusetts people and their lineal descendants, the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. And I live and work on this land, and Northeastern University is founded on this land. Such an acknowledgement is a necessary but inadequate step to being in right relation with the traditional and continuing caretakers.
And I too acknowledge that I'm speaking from the territory of the Nacotchtank people and their descendants, the Piscataway Conoy people, on whose land I live and work. And again, an inadequate symbolic gesture, but nonetheless important, especially as we engage in these virtual spaces with intense extractive infrastructures. So Sarah and I are going to talk about, we're going to provide a very fast overview of a project we just launched last week entitled A People's Atlas of Nuclear Colorado. So why the nuclear? Why are we interested in that and looking at that? Both Sarah and I had been working on the environmental aftermath of the Cold War in ways that combine scholarship and creative work. Sarah is an interdisciplinary research-based artist, and I'm a geographer who works in an interdisciplinary program within an international relations school of foreign service.
So about 10 years ago, we coalesced our overlapping interest in performative scholarship and the ethical and epistemological dimensions of toxicity to create a fictitious, or we prefer to say wishful, government agency to address the ongoing legacies of the Cold War. In the guise of the National Toxic Land and Labor Conservation Service, we conducted tours, produced government documents, images, and reports, and ran a series of regionally specific workshops to think through how to commemorate and publicly address the unaddressed toxic legacies of the military-industrial complex within the territorial boundaries of what is considered the United States. Through doing this work for about 5 years, we found, kind of not surprisingly, that younger people, generally under 40, had little knowledge of the Cold War except as a series of discrete events and near but averted crises. Knowledge of it as a structuring fact of American life, one that mobilized incredible apparatuses of slow violence, was obscured either by amnesia or by some kind of willful disavowal. There was also like a superimposition of climate anxiety over nuclear fear, which is not to say, of course, that climate anxiety is not important, but that I think they're imbricated in really important ways. We also found that people who had devoted their entire lives to nuclear issues tended to address them in very discrete ways, a particular site or a particular issue, because of either lived proximity or accumulated expertise. Geography, ideology, and issue boundaries often felt very, very firm. People were involved at the scale where they felt effective, but they were not aware of or connected to others working on other aspects of the nuclear, even within the same rough geography. So I want to just address a little bit the question of political timing, which I think Alex spoke to really beautifully. Now that we have a very slow project, not a rapid response project, but I should say that the TLC service is very much a product of the Obama years. He came to power with an undergraduate thesis on nuclear weapons that was seen to kind of potentially signal a change. Yet we actually saw a continuation of nuclear policy, which turned towards smaller, more usable, but no less deadly weapons. And then with the Trump administration, Shiloh started to see within her immediate sphere this immediate interest in invigorating an already existing desire for a hardened masculinist nuclear policy. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Shiloh?
Yeah, sure. make sure I'm unmuted. Okay. Yeah, I could see within my immediate sphere that the Trump administration really created this space to ramp back up discussions about reinvesting in both domestic uranium production, next generation nuclear weapons, often with very little knowledge of the status of actual status of mining and production sites across the US, many of which are 60 to 70 years old, let alone the implications on communities and environments within the territory claimed by the US and well beyond. And so in response, we decided that the strategies of a wishful government agency with its collision of satire and sincerity was, for us, not an appropriate means to confront and contest an administration that ascended to power on cynicism and misinformation. And with the scrubbing of government websites, the protection of basic information, as well as its accessible presentation, became crucial aspects to the project, along with the desire to create connections and linkages and knit together various aspects of the nuclear in a single platform.
So we alighted on the concept of an atlas as not just a collection of maps, but also of illustrations, charts, explanatory texts. We appreciated it as an accumulation of artifacts, visualizations, and analysis that had the capacity to skip forward and backwards in time, right? When you're dealing with the nuclear, you're looking at deep geological times, as well as certain visions of the immediate future. This uncertain temporality and ethos of accumulation really felt like the appropriate form for this work. So the atlas is this expanded geospatial archive. It includes Google Maps, as well as historical maps, site histories, issue briefs, personal narratives, artworks, scholarly essays. And I should say it's a highly interdisciplinary collaboration involving students, scholars from many different disciplines, activists, residents, and artists, over 40 contributors at this point. So Shiloh, do you want to show the atlas and talk about why Colorado?
Yeah, so quickly, let's see, just share my screen. Let's take a look. Why Colorado is a really great question. So more than any other location in the US, Colorado encompasses almost all of the stages of nuclear production and mobilization. And there are extensive already existing communities mobilized around these issues, but due to black boxing and compartmentalized governance, they remain fairly fragmented efforts. And so we wanted to build on these local practices and on the ground experiences in a more networked practice, building on relationships that we'd already established with the TLC service through workshops, and other activities, and also honoring and strengthening our territorial attachments to Colorado. Both Sarah and I have family and friends there, and place attachment is important ethically to us and to this project. And also choosing a geographical focus within the United States, really contests American, or we see it as a way to contest American exceptionalism, as well as settler colonial aphasia, drawing on Ann Stoller's work and via Ayosha Goldstein, Jody Byrne, and others, the inability of settler colonialism to even enter consciousness and language, and the notion that war has somehow not profoundly impacted and shaped the so-called homeland. And so this is particularly clear, again, looking back to this example I already cited about renewed calls for uranium production within the US and the framing of it as somehow foreign sources versus domestic, which is a deeply politicized position that does not acknowledge colonial occupation. So we're gonna look at the atlas here now. And I think, Sarah, I'm gonna do some, clicking around while Sarah narrates some of what is going on here.
Sure. So I should say that we got some degree of seed funding from both Georgetown University and Northeastern University, but this is very much a product of collaboration, and including an educational collaboration with Dr. Melanie Armstrong at Western Colorado University, our wonderful designers, and lots of wonderful student research assistants. So there are three primary ways to interact with the atlas. The search function allows you to look up really various things about the nuclear, right, missiles, mines, etc. You can navigate via a map view, which links to all sites, and you can see them in their kind of proximal or relation to one another. But this scale and format is impressive visually for its density, but it doesn't really provide any context. So the heart of the atlas is really a series of organized paths, which provide curated narrative arcs that are privileged in the interface design. And these seek to provide a way of introducing a site in relation to the issues, the histories, and the people who intersect with it.
So I want to quickly just show us where this design comes from, which is us kind of doing a riff on nuclear fuel cycle illustrations, and it's kind of cradle to cradle rhetoric. And you'll see, let me just quickly show this. You'll see that these fuel diagrams, let's start with this one actually, they suggest these discrete phases of the nuclear fuel cycle conceptually, spatially, and temporally, as if they're separated instances. And you also kind of see this magical endpoint of the creation of the nuclear product, as well as fully containable or reprocessable waste. And so this is just grabbed from a Google search. You can see that the fuel cycle is typically rendered through geometrical abstractions, like these spheres are really popular, or clip art aesthetics that domesticates the spaces of production and also obfuscates workers, the earth, communities, and so forth. And so renditions of this process completely occlude the actual relationships or possibilities between weapons and energy, and pretend that energy is the real reason for the technology, when in fact they're deeply imbricated and complex. And so what we've done then is to kind of think about combining these two processes purposely within the atlas. That's intentional, and also to think about the beginning and endpoints of the cycle and expanding on those to think through not just the technical production of things, but also the material, geological, and social practices that support this.
So very quickly, because we're coming to the end of our time, I want to say that there is this expanded fuel cycle has two sides, the kind of technocratic positivist side, and then the shadow side. And there's a design logic to these. So each path has an introduction, short introductory essay, and then you can explore materials and the kind of this blown out white aesthetic of the positivist rendition of the nuclear fuel cycle, and then at any point switch over to see the shadow side. The shadow side is not the negative, right? Which is, I think, really important to understand. It's the material effects that are produced by the positivist, and it is also generative. There's a lot of friction or opposition that's produced in the space of the shadow that then the positivist has to adjust to or respond to. So we can see, right, the friction of dissent and debate surrounding an emblematic site, such as the Rocky Flats plant. We can also see effects like occupational illnesses, obscured public oversight, and the compartmentalization of knowledge. And yet that can lead to, through activism, the closure of the Rocky Flats plant, the rollout of regulatory state, national and international frameworks. And yet we have always underlying all of this ungovernable materiality of radioactive waste and materials itself.
So just two concluding comments, which would just be, I think nuclear governance has really forced this compartmentalization of knowledge that has made it more difficult for activism around nuclear issues to make connections and offer more comprehensive critiques. So the atlas uses the fuel cycle as one way to understand sites and put them in relationship to each other within the production process of nuclear governance. So the interface is the argument, right? We provide dots on the map, but then that's not enough. So we then contextualize this with lots of spatial narratives. And then we also want in the atlas, with its emergent, not yet completeness, with its kind of inclusion of the shadow, to serve as a kind of civic infrastructure, allowing contributors to better position themselves, sites, their issues, research in a larger framework related to and impacted by nuclear governmentality, but never reducible to it. And our hope for people to take away from this is to think across the implications of all this connectively and intersectionally. It's deeply political, where one sets the edge of your project, right? And the horizon of your concern. So we'll stop that. Apologies for going slightly over.
Thank you all. I really like that last phrase, set the horizon and the boundary politics there. We'll come back to that later, but I will now introduce our third set of featured speakers. Very excited about this. Hokulani Aikau and Bernadette Gonzalez. Hoku is a professor at the University of Victoria in the Indigenous Governance Program. She's the author of A Chosen People, A Promised Land, Mormonism and Race in Hawaii. published in University of Minnesota Press, 2012. And Bernadette Gonzalez is Professor of American Studies. And together they are co-editors of Detours, a decolonial guide to Hawaii, and the Detour series of decolonial guides with Duke University Press. And I'll turn it over to them.
All right, so Hoku and I are actually going to talk a little bit more about old school technology, old school technologies of narrative and mapping, which is to say it's not necessarily mutually exclusive of new school technology. So we're going to talk about the guidebook. So initially, we sought in doing the Detours project to take the guidebook genre and deliberately pervert it in order to interrupt tourism's hold on Hawaii. We wanted to actively and intentionally disrupt and subvert the dominant imaginary and representations of Hawaii as a tropical paradise, an imaginary that is wholly based on a tourist gaze and the manufactured desire for a tropical vacation, the exotic at home, a fantasy island. And in Hawaii, as with other tourist destinations, this desire and imaginary are extractive. It is all about the tourist experience and what they can take home with them. So the form and function of the guidebook maintains and reproduces this tourist imaginary by tapping into the titillation of the exotic other. So over time, as we worked with the guidebook form, we found the genre, the form, and conventions of the guidebook to be too fixed to pervert. And the audience is specifically tourists in this kind of exchange. So once we started to look to the work of our contributors and what they were producing, our questions began to shift away from subversion towards decoloniality and restoration.
So our project really is guided by, if I could figure out how to use my screen, 3 questions, really around how do we do the guide differently. So how do we frame this alternative encounter with Hawaii as something worth engaging in, right? Because many of us, and this is part of the products, the material culture that's created around Hawaii really does produce a particular kind of desire for a particular kind of Hawaii. So how do we, provide a different encounter that also is something that people would want to engage in? How does this complex history of Hawaii as a sovereign, independent place guide the project's intervention? In particular, its decolonial vision, right? Again, thinking about what does decoloniality look like and mean in practice on the ground in Hawaii? How do we push back against the idea that the question of Hawaii's inclusion in the United States is a settled one, right? Because for many of us, it is not. So how do we do that with a form like the guidebook? And then our third question is, how do we balance writing about a place in loving detail and aloha without making it an open invitation, or making clear that there's a protocol for engaging or not engaging with certain places depending on one's positionality, right? So how do we uninvite folks to Hawaii? How do we tell tourists that they don't get to have an open invitation to everywhere whenever they want, right? Like, how do we engage in that kind of a conversation through this book form? So those are the 3 questions that were really guiding us in our project.
So over the course of several years, our process resulted in Detours. Detours is a decolonial guide. So we moved away from the guidebook to a guide that curates essays, personal reflections, artwork, and maps created by activists, artists, academics, and communities working to critique and dismantle settler colonialism in Hawaii and offer models for how to restore Ea. And Ea is, that previous slide, refers to the breath and sovereignty of the Lahui, the people, the Aina, the land and its people. So as a guide that contributes to decolonization, it decenters the tourist gaze, reorienting relationships to place according to, reorienting relationships to place according to those practices and ethics that contribute to the work of decolonization. So while this project wholly supports the work of decolonization, we didn't want to just critique and dismantle it. We felt it was equally important to offer an otherwise to the tourist desire to consume and extract. So
and here's our,
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you go.
No, you go ahead. I think it's actually you.
Okay, and so here's where the slide that I showed a minute ago is really about, what is Ea. So this is a Hawaiian term, again, that gets generally used when talking about sovereignty, but our colleague Noelani Goodyear Kaupua really fleshed this out in her introduction to the amazing collection, A Nation Rising. And here, as it reads on the screen, Ea is based on the experiences of people on the land, relationships forged through the process of remembering and caring for wahipana, or storied places. Ea is the active state of being. Ea cannot be achieved or possessed. It requires constant action, day after day, generation after generation. And it's this sort of verb that we were really interested in, the verb form of Ea that we were really interested in capturing and enlivening with our book, and with the contributions that with the pieces that our contributors had given us to curate and to bring together. We also saw Ea as being a really important counterbalance to decolonization. So it's not enough just to decolonize, to break down, to disrupt, to dismantle, but we also needed to provide something in its place. We needed to, and so for us, this looks like, in a Hawaiian context, the restoration of Ea, right? The bringing forward of Ea, that breath, that life, that sovereignty, once again.
So here's the next slide kind of captures abbreviated table of contents, and this is how the book ended up being organized, right? As it sort of developed, we realized that this was a collection not just for tourists, but also for ourselves, the people here in Hawaii. How do we narrate ourselves? How do we come to understand the legacies and the presence and the futures that we imagine that shape this place and shape us? So you can see here that we've got a section on wahipana and storied places. This allows for people to delve a bit deeper into specific places and tell their genealogies, right, of those stories. We have Hana Lima, which refers really to the work, the decolonial work of representation, but also muscle, that requires muscle and effort and sweat here in Hawaii. And a lot of that has to do with restoration, right? And then we have Huaka'i, which isn't just tours, but tours that aim to transform. And then finally, we have part 4, new mappings of Hawaii beyond the big 8 islands. And so it takes us beyond Hawaii, but also deeper into Hawaii. And then we finally end the collection with A'ole Ipau, which means the work is not yet finished, right? That it keeps, decolonization is a constant kind of struggle and a constant kind of imaginary formation of dreaming for something better in the future here. So what we're going to do now is kind of just show you a couple of the examples of what we curated in the book from artists and from folks who are actually offering these huaka'i on the ground. So Hoku, you want to take it away?
Sure. So as I think Sarah and Shiloh were saying, that they had like 40-something contributors, and we have 40-something contributors as well. And so this is just a small sampling. The first one we wanted to show is this. So Kapulani Landgraf did a series of art pieces that are intended to really bring a visual representation of the impact of tourism. And so what we have here, Pu'unene flattened, it's basically a sand mound where excavators have removed the sand and shipped it to other islands in order to to make the beaches on like Oahu nicer for tourists. And so the text that surrounds the pu'u is in Hawaiian. And the series really is all about thinking about extraction and the relationship between extraction, development, and tourism, and how the very land itself has been also uprooted and moved and forced into the tourist economy and the tourist capital system, not just people and bodies and things, the land itself, the very sand of that comprise this this spot. And many of these places are where my Hawaiian ancestors would have buried their loved ones, right? And so these pu'u were also burial grounds. And so what does it mean, right, to disrupt the burial grounds of ancestors, and then use that sand for something like tourism and to be commodified in that way? So again, all of those kinds of meanings and complexities and contradictions are represented in a series of art pieces that Kapulani did, and that we were super excited to have reproduced in the book.
This is a map that sort of captures in simplistic fashion. It's by Adele Balderston, a narrative tour that Craig House created. He didn't just create it for the book, but he has offered it in the past. And Craig is a longtime settler ally, colleague of ours in the English department, and he wanted to offer a palimpsestic mapping of indigenous and colonial histories within a few blocks in Hawaii. So this captures a lot of those layered histories of settling, of sort of almost warfare, of overthrow. And the next slide shows this tour actually at work in one of the workshops we did over the course of the many years we were at work on this project. So Craig is the one in the sort of pale colored hat, and Kyle Kajihiro in the red shirt is another one of our contributors who actually also offers another tour. Craig's tour ends here at Iolani Palace, which is the site, which is the oldest, well, no, not the oldest, but it is the site of the Hawaiian monarchy, and is also the site of the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. And so Kyle's tour starts here, and his tour is a tour of militarization in Hawaii and demilitarization in Hawaii.
Because we're out of time, we're just going to end with this slide. So Kyle's tour takes folks through Chinatown up to the base up on the hill. I don't have the notes on it. To Camp Smith, I think it is, yes, up on the hill that overlooks all of Pearl Harbor, and then it ends down here at Pearl Harbor, right? And what they're trying to do is to make the militarism and the expansiveness of the military visible in Hawaii for folks, and then also work to disrupt that, right? And so when they're down here in Pearl Harbor, you know, they're talking about, this is Auntie Terry and Kyle are really talking about both the Hawaiian stories that live in these places, as well as the way that the military impacts those stories, and really making what has often been incommensurable and invisible visible again. And so because we're out of time, I'm going to end it there, but we can talk more about all the different kinds of contributions that we received, and even the way that we've started to work with the digital, and we can even talk about why we stayed with the book instead of going in a digital format, because again, those are all questions that we've had to grapple with over time. But thank you all.
Thank you both very much. I have lots of questions, but I will wait as I'm supposed to here and turn it over to our discussant, Joe Gouldy. And before Joe, you go here and I introduce you, I just want to remind our viewers and listeners, please put questions in the chat box. That's going to be the next thing that we go to after this. So if you've been ruminating on something, this is the time to start thinking about what you want to ask our panelists. Joe, back to introducing our discussant. Joe is a historian of land use. She has a new book coming out in March. Is that right? I got that right here. Yes, coming out in March about the global struggles for occupancy rights. Now, squatters, indigenous peoples, African Americans, South Asians, urban renters, and environmentalists share a common past and maybe destiny. That sounds incredibly interesting. For a longer description of Joe's work, etc., please look at the chat bar, and I'll pass it over to her for discussing comments.
Arjun, thanks. And what a great privilege to be here today with all of you. I'm so moved. This has been a presentation of such excellence. Separados is a model of scholarship and activism that I have been citing in virtually every article I've written over the past 3 years. A People's Atlas of Nuclear Colorado is a model of the kind of environmental mapping of toxic waste in our backyards that's at the forefront of environmental activism and the fight for a livable planet right now. It's peeling back the wheel of time to see how past sins are literally making people sick in the present, and how limited has been the civic understanding of what happens in citizens' own backyards. And Detours has launched a full-scale book series now through the University of Hawaii Press. They are, in this first volume, pioneering a kind of cultural experience, which is also an intervention helping people see through the colonial landscape around them, the world of consumption, into the experience of colonized people and their sacred, emotional, and social need for the land on which they live. So thank you. Wow, wow, great job, everybody. So I'm gonna give you my gloss. I'm gonna give you my scholar's gloss and quick, because I wanna make room in this Q&A to democratize the session a little. So here's my prompt, so you can start thinking about it. There are many students, experts, artists, and activists on this call who have mapping projects of their own or experiences of their own. So I want to encourage you right now. We want to hear from you. It's not often that we get to all of the critical mapping people together. So what were you moved by? What are your questions? And also, what should we know? What other projects should we be aware of? Do you have critical walking tours or critical maps in your neighborhood or your community that we should be aware of? Please let us know, even if we don't have time to dive. So then other participants in the call can be aware of them, and we can have a lively, I want to encourage a lively back and forth even while I'm talking and while other people are talking. It's one of the joys of a multi-system, multi-levels of communication system, is that we can do this at the same time. We can ask panelists questions, they can answer while somebody else is talking. So don't hold back. Go ahead and ask more questions in the chat. Means more opportunity to answer. For you to grab them while I'm talking. I won't feel challenged at all. Okay, so I want to give you my gloss on why these interventions are so important. This is the forefront of critical mapping practices, something that didn't exist when I was in college. One heading is interventions in landscape. We can talk about it in terms of the phenomenology, the city and the everyday landscape. Projects of this kind are illuminating the hidden aspects of what you see every day as you walk through your neighborhood or drive down the highway. This is exactly what art aspired to in the era of Dickens, Balzac, Benjamin, or Desserteau. It's an unmasking. What we see is a series of critical mapping projects that offer a shift of perspective on everyday life. And it has the potential to change the experience of everyday journeys and interactions. It has the capacity to draw out attention to hidden kinds of harm, much in the way that Rachel Carson did in Silent Spring. She pointed to atrocities hidden in plain sight. So these are also a kind of technology of living in place. They're creating a possibility of new kinds of solidarity between strangers who have been drawn to study the real instances of pain, imprisonment, and contamination together, and to attend to them by mapping them. And this is how the unknown becomes known. We're also seeing this kind of critical mapping practices more than just art. I want to emphasize that. There's a politics to it, the opportunity to meet each other, to study what's happening in the everyday landscape and how people are unaware of the nuclear waste in their backyard or the military presence and how it continues to change the islands and disrupt cemetery sites. It's something like an active state of being, in Hoku and Bernadette's wonderful phrase, something that's renewed that asks for us to renew our experiences to the earth and to each other through documentation and observation, not unlike the indigenous concept of Ea that we were offered, if I may borrow that here to underline it. That's so beautiful. What a wonderful concept for orienting us. Thank you for that. We can also talk about it. So that's the landscape part, the landscape and the ethics. We can also talk about it from the angle of time. We can also talk about critical mapping as an intervention in terms of the history of institutions and technology. Enormous themes of modern history. Now, some of these projects were more digital than others. Alex's project, Separados, involves digital practitioners working together to gather and mine data about the military industrial prison complex and how it's affecting bodies of people of color and especially children. The implication in that, particular investors and corporations. So we're unveiling them. Well, there's a politics of publishing here. In a long history of democracy, democracy has depended on using technology to make transparent the organs of rule, going back all the way to the printing press. There are linkages between the newspaper and democracy that have been through since the 19th century. Through the vote, the worker cooperative, through participatory mapping going back to the 1970s, and maybe more contentiously, internet chat rooms and social media sites, we see kinds of technology that are transforming public experience and allowing citizens to talk with each other about the conditions of rule and governance. And it's important to know that these critical mapping projects are coming about in the context of an enormous experiment with democracy. And I mean, in part, the regimes of wiping government websites that we have seen in American history recently under the Trump administration that were mentioned earlier. And I also mean, of course, the protests, the Black Lives Matters protests, the other protests that have been around recently, but I also mean something more. I'm also thinking of the civic assemblies in places like Ireland and Iceland, which have been experimenting with what happens when you get citizens together by sortition in operating like a jury to inspect documents and make decisions and recommend legislation. This is how abortion was legalized in Ireland. I'm thinking about Taiwan's experiment with making all ministers' correspondence transparent and recorded and shared online, which reveals evidence of how lobbying takes place. We are experimenting with more than just how to walk through your city and understand your neighborhood here. We're talking about experiments with infrastructures of allowing people to see the reality of the forms of governance around them. And that is extremely valuable in the moment of a crisis of democracy. Participatory mapping is at least potentially about counterpublics, shadow governments, documenting environmental harm and human harm in such a way as to make them governable, knowable by the fixable community, and potentially fixable. Mapping ice centers or sites of colonialism and toxic contamination, they're putting together an agenda list for legislation, for acts of voluntary repair, for acts of money or disinvestment. So I want to press on this in the Q&A. I'm going to give you an easy, a medium, and a hard question. And it is up to each practitioner what you answer. And maybe you should only choose one, small, medium, or large, so that we can make room for other people's questions, because I am in earnest. Please democratize the chat. The more questions you ask, the more opportunities for the panelists to answer, the more you share, the more we know about each other and this movement. We only have until 5:45, so we have a short 20-minute open Q&A after I ask this question. So let's go. My question, the easy one. How do these critical mapping practices create new points of access for ordinary citizens? It's an important question. But how is this different than an old-fashioned atlas? So talk us through. Medium. I am moved by Sarah's discussion of boundary politics. She talks about how mapping helped people become aware that contamination in their backyard was also like contamination in somebody else's backyard. And there's an opportunity for neighbors to work together. So this is a solidarity practice. How is your practice helping those solidarities to grow? Now here's the hard one, and this is what I really want to know about, but it's up to you. I want you to lean in. If your project formed the infrastructure for an actual government department with money and responsibility for reducing harm, what would that department do? What harm would it mitigate? Who would be qualified to submit evidence of harm? And how would that shift attention, work, and money, and where attention, work, and money are spent in aggregate today? Help us to see where democracy needs to go, please. Great. The queue is open. I'm going to read some of the comments aloud until I see hands from the panelists. I hear Soyuka Colbert saying, thank you for the brilliant papers. I agree. Kumail Zaidi says, thank you all for the presentation. I have a question about the process of decolonizing our physical and social relationship to nuclear wastelands. And I'm going to let you read some more. Do any of the panelists want to respond and continue? I see Bernadette, please.
We'll go.
I'm going to take your medium question about solidarity. Often what we get asked is, what do we learn about Hawaii after reading this book, after sort of digesting a lot of the narratives and stories and remappings that are in it? And one of the things that we actually kind of turn it around is that our hope is not just that you learn about Hawaii and how do you reorient your desires and the desires that you bring with you and the desires that structure your, the way that you see Hawaii as this fantasy place, but how you might bring those lessons back home to where you live, right? How might you think about your own place and the place that you inhabit, and how might you reorient the way that you approach and know that place, to know the indigenous histories of the place, to know the different kinds of race relations that shape that place. And so that's kind of one of the things that we hope that the book does, and the series itself does. But I think that the focus on Hawaii as a place was really key for us, because it's such a fantasized about site, right? But that the hope then is to take the sort of unsettling work that that Detours does, that we hope it does, back home to where you might live.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you. So the power of stories to unite people and to validate experience. Thank you, Bernadette. Other panelists, would other panelists like to respond to any of the questions?
I think I'll also speak to that question of solidarities, if I may. So in positing the nuclear fuel cycle, or this kind of poetic elaboration of the nuclear fuel cycle as the governing organizational logic of the Atlas, we're really inviting people to read themselves into that process. So everyone is imbricated, right, in nuclearity. Everyone is imbricated in the US military industrial complex, albeit in very, very different ways and in different positions. And in structuring the Atlas around one model of that imbrication, we are asking people to read themselves into it, to understand their position vis-a-vis people who are more directly or indirectly harmed than they are, so that solidarity is not an abstract acting on behalf of or being concerned about something outside of yourself, right? So that, but rather a recognition of how your experiences and fate are entwined with others.
I think that's exactly right, Sarah, and thank you for expanding on that. That's one of the reasons why mapping is such a powerful device. Mapping and network analysis are probably the two technologies that we have for really literally drawing connections and showing how my neighborhood is related to the experience of other neighborhoods. Those connections are hidden in plain sight until they are revealed by our practices of storytelling, of illumination, of design, of data analysis. And that's one of the reasons why your work and the work of the other panelists is so powerful. I see Shiloh's hand. Shiloh, will you talk to us about your project? And you're on mute.
Classic, wow. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on then that point. I guess the medium question. But another thing that I think is interesting across the projects, and something that I know Sarah and I have come to really value, especially in the organization of the Atlas, is kind of the convergence of art and activism, community building, and pedagogy as a kind of building resource tools for action, but in a way creating this convergence of material that might seed new understandings and build relationships across sites and seemingly disparate issues. So I think, one of our questions was, how do we build a civic infrastructure that invites different knowledges and forms of meaning making, and have different kinds of materials there, sort of geospatial, historical, oral history, first person, art-based, and so forth, in ways that can coexist in the same space, as a living resource and platform to be mobilized by people without having to have sort of consensus or one story. So the design ends up being the kind of argument and the methodology, while there's all this other content in it that is more open and flexible and completely additive constantly. And so I see that actually across these projects in really interesting ways. And that's regardless of the digital v analog or whatever we want to say about prying apart that binarism. So thanks.
I think that's one of the great strengths of this panel is that we have artists, we have designers, we have makers. Alex is a hacker librarian. We have scholars who have gone out into the community who have transcended their professional roles. And those of you we've got 56 people on this call. That's amazing for an academic panel. Hooray. I am curious, those of you in the audience who are on the chat, how many of you are scholars, artists, designers, hackers, data workers? How do you identify members of the community? Or just people who are interested? I think the panelists would all love to hear about that. Let's see, Hoku, Alex, would you like to respond to any of the questions? To my questions?
Yeah, there's a question from Rua. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly on the chat. He's recently graduated from Cornell, and he's asking a question about genre. And it's like he notices that all three of our talks actually use a tool. It's just the old master's tool question, right? We use a tool that is used for violence, and we subvert it somehow. But he actually channels that master's tool into the question of genre, and I think he's hearing irony or ironic use in some of the things that we're doing. I personally don't think there's anything ironic about the use of maps and torn apart separados or the use of data. I think I also don't see irony in the other genres that are being explored here. This is interesting because even the Dietrich guide, which one would, I think that would be the easiest one to try to channel into irony. It actually has a certain kind of earnestness and seriousness about it that makes it really hard for at least for me. I'll let the authors, the editors speak for them. But what I want to say though is that I think your question is one that we should leave open. The question of how we use these tools, these genres, should be one that we should leave open to those who come after us, who will engage in different forms of resistance, of decolonization, of mobilization, so that we explore as many of the possibilities as possible in ways that we can subvert, counter attack, counter surveil. And I think the irony, I think irony is very limited, and I think this is the way that I think Brooklynites resist. I live in Manhattan, so I don't resist through irony. So this would be my answer to your question. I think it's a fascinating question, but one that I encourage us to leave open. And really quickly, I want you to notice how Torn Apart is a new genre of publication. To point to Joe's citation of the long history of publication as a democratic force. We are combining data visualization and mapping with academic essays. And we're also using the model of the volume. So in a sense, it's also borrowing from the genre of the journal. So there's a temporality to it that borrows from the long history of the academic journal, but now ties it to data visualization. There are even more intricate and detailed ways in which this is a generic intervention that will get us talking with using technological jargon. So I'll avoid those. But all of that to say is that I think all of us in this call are very aware of genre, and I think we probably move beyond the simple postmodern ironic response to things. I'll let the other panelists, if they want to chime in on that question.
And just to seed a couple more questions from the chat, Ohus is a couple of people are interested in your interactions with audiences or the publics, or how you might draw in other people. Ohus is asking, how big is your audience? Muriel is asking, how have audiences reacted to this? Kamil is asking, what about the parts of the earth that have been rendered uninhabitable and have no one to speak for them, like the Bikini Atoll? What about the ones that are so politically fragmented No one speaks for them. Who speaks for the Caribbean? Alex, a question. And we, so let me make room if any of the panelists want to talk. Coco, would you like to answer any questions?
Sure, I'll say a little bit. I think, well, I totally agree with Alex, right? That we're all writing with and against various genres. And I think to be critical of them and to work with them in really intentional kinds of ways, and perhaps in ways that they were never intended to do, is part of the fun of this work, right? For me, working on detours and working with, like we said, 40 something contributors who were all grappling with one genre or another towards a similar goal, right? Towards the goal of offering readers who will come to the book a plethora of ways to engage in decoloniality, right? From various and varied standpoints, right? And so that was, and it required a lot of focused attention and thoughtfulness at every step of the way. And so it isn't ironic. It really is like gritty work to work with these technologies of oppression and colonization and violence in a different kind of way. Yeah, that's the work, right? Like that's what we got to do. I mean, I have colleagues who talk about like, oh, is this, like these tools. I mean, I think about this in my context all the time as a Hawaiian. I think, one thing that I love about my ancestors is they were always working with new technologies. They were always working with new stuff, right? Like I worked with a community group in Hawaii that had the most sophisticated wetland taro system that utilized and irrigation systems as one part of a super complex food system, right? Like that's like civil engineering genius. Those are all technologies. And we get to be, and when we work with new technologies and adapt them towards our decolonial or AI goals, we're doing that work. We're just engaging and working with, everything that around, just as our ancestors did. So I just want to disrupt that binary between, we can't use that because it's colonial. Oh no, we're going to take it all back, right? And so we got to work with that. I think one of the what I love about all of these projects and how they come together really is really speaking to the urgency of the crisis that we are not just in now, but that has been building and constant for a long time, right? I mean, thinking about the military's impact globally, the nuclear impact, right? I mean, yeah, the mapping that you all did, it's like, oh my gosh, we need to do that in Utah. We need to do that in Nevada. We need to do that across the Pacific. We need to do that, right? Like, what would it look like, a map look like of that in Hawaii? Like, when we're thinking about carceral places and where, I mean, the relationship, at least one of the things that we explore in our book, between ICE and private prisons, right? And we need to use, again, whatever is available to us to disseminate and to think with and to keep pushing so that we can undo some of this work and find collaborators. So that's.
Thank you for that, Holger. This is sometimes I see people around me give up because they're left toolless because their concepts drive them into inaction, and sometimes we let our concepts get the best of us. And I think all three projects here show how we can actually be aware of what we're doing, but our intentionality is what makes the difference. Thank you for that.
That's right. And thank you for that powerful intervention, Alex. That is what we need to hear. I look forward to the co-authored article, white paper, book, whatever it is, called Tearing Down the Master's House, a manifesto. We have 3 more minutes. Does any brave panelist, I'm taking my privilege here as your interlocutor, and I'm going to ask if any brave panelist wants to take on the third rail question. Are you making a shadow government when you mount ICE detention centers and nuclear waste and the sites of colonialism? And if it's voluntary, market-based, or government-based, what would you see the larger scale intervention look like?
I'll start, since we can go in the order to close it really quick. The super short answer, the TV answer, is shadow governments and shadow worlds have always been around. There's always a dominant one. And then there's the rest of us that have been defeated, or the rest of us who are yet to, start fighting. But we have always been around. The shadows have been here.
I'll follow up on that. And I think this connects to the question also of the master's tools, right? We sometimes talk about the tools as if they exist outside of social processes. So we're not just adopting a tool, but we're actually coming up with a different way of enacting it every time we adopt it. And that is a form of governance. It might be a form of governance that is operating just within a collective of 5 or 6 people during the space of an intensive sort of hackathon design session, or in terms of how a project chooses to govern itself, both within and outside of the university. We're always engaged in practices of governance. They don't necessarily have to be from the top down, and tools, while neutral, are also can be activated differently depending on how we use and propagate them.
Very nice. Shiloh.
I'm going to pass. I'm still thinking. I like that answer. Thank you, Sarah. I mean, I think that's part of the use of the tools, is to how not to be governed like that. And you are already, by virtue of using these quote tools, again, not value neutral, but in these other ways, are ungoverning what exists and creating new futures or new openings and so forth, new relationships. So which is just saying again pretty much what Sarah said, only she said it more eloquently.
I'll also bite. I think that for Hoku and I, it's not necessarily about creating an actual government department, but actually getting rid of the United States presence in Hawaii. Completely, right? And we see this already as something that is an emergent movement that is captured in little kinds of pieces and narratives and detours, right? We see a nation rising, we see Lahui, we see moments of this kind of really coalescing with the protests against the building of the 30-meter telescope in Mauna Kea, right? Where we see massive amounts of people, Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian, right? Coming together and saying, no, enough is enough. And so I think that it would really be how it would work. It would work with demilitarization. It would work with giving the land back, right? So those are the sort of terms of this kind of decolonization work. It's not just narrative, but it's actually, it's happening, right? And there are those narratives about restorations of fish pond, restorations of foodways, restorations of the way land ought to work and feed us, right? And the way that we ought to take care of the land. I think that that's all happening here in Hawaii. And it's really inspiring to see those kinds of moments become real and be able to kind of tell those stories in detours.
Beautiful answer. And Hoku, would you like to wrap us up?
I'm just going to underline what Sarah said about, and all of what Bernadette just said is connected back to governance, right? What are the values and principles that are going to guide our individual behavior and our collective decision-making practices, right? And we have to live by those. And I think part of what that looks like is that we also have to de-link from, capitalism and heteropatriarchy and, racism. We have to do all of that work too, so that we really can govern, and the macro all the way up through, I think scaling all of this is super, super critical. And I think a lot of this work really speaks to the need to think about governance in relationship to scale, so that we can live into our values and visions for alternative, decolonial, anti-racist, anti-homophobic, all of that future, right? Like, this is liberation. It's ours. It's now. We got to make it happen.
And that is the perfect note to end the perfect panel on. Hoku, thank you for that rousing and energizing call to vision. I want to give a round of thanks and shout outs. Thank you to the Mortara Center at Georgetown for hosting us and for providing organizational support. Thank you so much to Sarah and Shiloh for having this wonderful idea and bringing us all together. What has just been the most delicious feast of ideas that I've been to for a long time. Thank you, Arjun, for helping and leading us through and providing support. And thank you to our wonderful other panelists, Alex and Hoku and Bernadette. Thank you so much. It's such a delight to be here. Everyone else, please stay in touch with all of us, and we'll see you around next time.